Hey guys, sorry about not having video earlier. This is a new recording situation for me, and so I'm kind of still getting used to it. All right, so we're going to look at this chapter titled Backpacks versus Briefcases, Steps Toward Rhetorical Analysis. We're starting our rhetoric study, and rhetoric is not just what people say. It's how they say it. It's what they're communicating, not just with like their words, but also them and their actions and things like that. So let's read this. Excuse me. Okay, first impressions. Imagine the first day of class in first year composition at your university. The moment your professor walked in the room, you likely began analyzing her and making assumptions about what kind of teacher she'll be. You might have noticed what kind of bag she's carrying. A tattered leather satchel, a hot pink polka-dotted backpack, a burgundy briefcase. You probably also noticed what she's wearing. Trendy slacks and an untucked striped shirt, a skirted suit, jeans and a t-shirt. It's likely the above observations were only a few of the observations you made as your professor walked in the room. You might also have noticed her shoes, her jewelry, whether she wears a wedding ring, how her hair is styled, whether she stands tall or slumps, how quickly she walks, or maybe even if her nails are done. If you don't tend to notice any of these things about your professors, you certainly do about the people around you, your roommates, others in your residence halls, students you're assigned to work with in groups, or a prospective date. For most of us, many of the people we encounter in a given day are subject to this kind of quick analysis. Now, as you form this kind of analysis, you likely didn't walk through each question one by one, write out the answer, and then add up the responses to see what kind of person you're interacting with. Instead, you quickly took in the information and made an informed and likely somewhat accurate decision about that person. Over the years, as you've interacted with others, you've built a mental database that you can draw on to make conclusions about what the person's looks tell you about their personality. You've become able to analyze quickly what people are saying about themselves through the way they choose to dress, accessorize, or wear their hair. We have, of course, heard that you can't judge a book by its cover, but in fact, we do it all the time. Daily, we find ourselves in situations where we're forced to make snap judgments. Each day, we meet different people, encounter unfamiliar situations, and see media that asks us to do, think, buy, and act in all sorts of ways. In fact, our saturation in media and its images is one of the reasons why learning to do rhetorical analysis is so important. The more we know about how to analyze situations and draw informed conclusions, the better we can become about making savvy judgments about the people, situations, and media we encounter. So that's the why that we're studying this. I want you guys to think, about all of the images that you encounter on a daily basis. I mean, like when you're on Facebook or Twitter or, whatever your favorite mode of social media is, the ads, even on Snapchat, there are ads. And so you need to understand that people are trying to sell you something and how they're trying to do it and what they're doing. Rhetoric is so important, and understanding how to analyze the situation, understanding constraints and things like that, that is so important for you to do. And so that's what we're going to talk about this week. Okay, so the implications of rhetorical analysis. My background is in media, and so this is one of those things that I kind of, I hope that everyone gets, because it is so important. You're so inundated all the time. Media is one of the most important places where this kind of analysis needs to happen. So rhetoric, the way we use language and images to persuade, is what makes media work. Think of all the media you see and hear every day. Twitter, television shows, web pages, billboards, text messages, podcasts. Even as you read this chapter, more ways to get those messages out to you quickly and in a persuasive manner are being developed. Media is constantly asking you to buy something, act in some way, believe something to be true, or interact with others in a specific manner. Understanding rhetorical messages is essential to help us become informed consumers, but it also helps evaluate the ethics of messages, how they affect us personally, and how they affect society. Take, for example, a commercial for men's deodorant that tells you that you'll be irresistible to women if you use their product. This campaign doesn't just ask you to buy the product, though. It also asks you to trust the company's credibility or ethos and to believe the messages they send about how men and women react about sexuality, and about what constitutes a healthy body. You have to decide whether or not you'll choose to buy the product and how you'll choose to respond to the messages that the commercial sends. Now, breaking it down like that, it seems a lot more complicated than it actually is in our daily lives, because these are judgment calls that you make after you watch an ad. You have to assume that this company is credible enough to tell you we're the experts in the way people smell. We're the experts in the way people interact. And so those value judgments take place quickly, but they do take place. Okay, let's see. Or in another situation, a Facebook group asks you to support healthcare reform. The rhetoric in this group uses people's stories of their struggles to obtain affordable health care. These stories, which are often heart-wrenching, use emotion to persuade you, also called pathos. You're asked to believe that healthcare reform is necessary and urgent, and you're asked to act on those beliefs by calling your congresspersons and asking them to support the reforms as well. Because media rhetoric surrounds us, it's important to understand how rhetoric works. If we refuse to stop and think about how and why it persuades us, we can become mindless consumers who buy into arguments about what makes us value ourselves and what makes us happy. For example, research has shown that only 2% of women consider themselves beautiful, which has been linked to the way that the fashion industry defines beauty. We're also told by the media that buying more stuff can make us happy, but historical surveys show that U.S. happiness peaked in the 1950s, when people saw as many advertisements in their lifetime as the average American sees in 1 year. Our worlds are full of these kinds of social influences. As we interact with other people and with media, we're continually creating and interpreting rhetoric. In the same way you decide how to process, analyze, or ignore these messages, you create them. You probably think about what your clothing will communicate as you go to a job interview or get ready for a date. You're also using rhetoric when you try to persuade your parents to send you money or your friends to see the movie that interests you. When you post to your blog or tweet, you're using rhetoric. In fact, according to rhetorician Kenneth Burke, rhetoric is everywhere. Wherever there's persuasion, there's rhetoric. And whenever there's meaning, there's persuasion. Food eaten and digested is not rhetoric. But in the meaning of food, there's much rhetoric. The meaning being persuasive enough for the idea of food to be used, like the ideas of religion, as the rhetorical device of statesmen. So in other words, most of our actions are persuasive in nature. What we choose to wear, like tennis shoes versus flip-flops, where we shop, like Whole Foods versus Walmart, or, in a lot of our cases, we're in small towns and there's not much of a choice, but you know what I mean. Like maybe what you buy at Walmart, right? What we eat, organic versus fast food, or even the way we send information, like snail mail versus text messages, can work to persuade others. Chances are you've grown up learning to interpret and analyze these types of rhetoric. They become so commonplace that we don't even realize how often and how quickly we're able to perform this kind of rhetorical analysis. When your teacher walked in on the first day of class, you probably didn't think to yourself, I think I'll do some rhetorical analysis on her clothing and draw some conclusions about what kind of personality she might have and whether I think I'll like her. And yet you were probably able to come up with some conclusions based on the evidence you had. However, when this same teacher hands you an advertisement, photograph, or article and asks you to write a rhetorical analysis of it, you might have been baffled or felt a little overwhelmed. The good news is that many of the analytical processes that you already use to interpret the rhetoric around you are the same ones you'll use for these assignments. So the same thing that makes you look at somebody walking down the hall and go and say, oh, that person's wearing a 5-finger death punch shirt, they've got to be a certain type of person and into certain music. That's rhetorical analysis. So you guys are already doing this. We're just going to talk about a more formal way to do it. And throughout this week and the next, I believe, I don't have the course outline in front of me, you're going to do some rhetorical analysis over some famous speeches. And so we'll be taking a look at some of those together. Excuse me. So let's get back to what we got here. Okay, the rhetorical situation or discerning context. One of the first places to start is context. Rhetorical messages always occur in a specific situation or context. The president's speech might respond to a specific global event, like an economic summit. That's part of the context. You choose your clothing depending on where you're going or what you're doing. That's context. A television commercial comes on during specific programs and at specific points of day. That's context. A billboard's placed in a specific part of the community. That's context too. In an article called The Rhetorical Situation, Lloyd Bitzer argues that there are 3 parts to understanding the context of a rhetorical moment: the exigence, audience, and constraints. Exigence is the circumstance or condition that invites a response. So you might want to write down there in your margins exigence and then write down circumstance, okay? So, imperfection marked by urgency is a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. In other words, rhetorical discourse is usually responding to some sort of a problem. So you begin a piece's exigence by asking, what's this rhetoric responding to? What might happen to make this rhetor, which is the person who creates the rhetoric, respond in this way? The exigence can be extremely complex, like the need for a new Supreme Court justice, or it can be simpler, like receiving an email that asks you where you or your friends should go on the road trip for your road trip this weekend. Understanding the exigence is important because it helps you begin to discover the purpose of the rhetoric. It helps you understand what the discourse is trying to accomplish. Okay? So another part of the rhetorical context is the audience. And so write this down too, please, on your margins. The audience is either the intended or unintended recipient of the message. So the audience should be able to respond to the exigence, okay? So the audience are the recipients, intended or unintended, of the rhetorical message, and they should be able to respond to the exigence, okay? In other words, the audience should be able to help address the problem. You might be very frustrated with your campus's requirement that all first-year students purchase a meal plan for on-campus dining. You might even send an email to a good friend back home voicing that frustration. However, if you want to address the exigence of the meal plans, then the most appropriate audience would be the person/office on campus that oversees meal plans. Your friend back home cannot solve the problem, though she may be able to offer sympathy or give you some good suggestions. But the person who can change the meal plan requirements is probably on campus. Rhetors make all sorts of choices based on their audience. Audience can determine the type of language used, the formality of the discourse, the medium or delivery of the rhetoric, and even the types of reasons used to make the rhetor's argument. Understanding the audience helps you begin to see and understand the rhetorical moves that the rhetor makes. And you guys even experienced that in your essays. You remember how I kept telling you, this is a formal essay, this is a formal essay? Because your audience is me. Your audience is academic in nature. Your audience is a formal audience. If you'd written these papers, like the analysis of Schindler's List, if you had written that for a friend, your language would have been a lot less formal. You probably would have used the word you. You probably would have used some contraction. So audience is very important. It's like the difference in what a text message to your mom looks like and what a text message to your best friend looks like, right? They're different. You use different language and different ways to speak. Okay. The last piece of the rhetorical situation is the constraints. And this one's kind of hard to figure out sometimes. The constraints of the rhetorical situation are those things that have the power to constrain decision and action needed to modify the exigence. So write out there on your margin or whatever, how you want to do it. The constraints are the things that have the power to constrain decision and reaction, okay? So constraints have a lot to do with how the rhetoric is presented. Constraints can be beliefs, attitudes, documents, facts, traditions, images, interests, or motives. Constraints limit the way discourse is delivered or communicated. Constraints may be something as simple as your instructor limiting your proposal to 1,000 words, or they may be far more complex, like the kinds of language you need to use to persuade a certain community. So how do you apply this to a piece of rhetoric? Well, let's say you are flipping through a magazine and you come across an advertisement that has a large headline that reads, "Why some people say dough when you say Homer." This ad is an Ad Council public service announcement to promote arts education and is sponsored by Americans for the Arts and NAMM, the trade association of the international music products industry. Since you want to understand more about what this ad means and what it wants you to believe or do, you begin to think about the rhetorical situation. You first might ask, what's the ad responding to? What problem does it hope to address? That's the exigence. In this case, the exigence is the cutting of arts funding and the children's lack of exposure to the arts. According to the Ad Council's website, the average kid is provided insufficient time to learn and experience the arts. This PSA campaign was created to increase involvement in championing arts education both in and out of school. The PSA is responding directly to the fact that kids are not getting enough arts education. Then you might begin to think about to whom the Ad Council targeted the ads. Unless you're a parent, you're probably not the primary audience. And if you continued reading the text of the ad, you'd notice that there's information to persuade parents that the arts are helpful to their children and to let them know how to help their children become more involved with the arts. The ad tells parents that the experience will for sure do more than entertain them. It'll build their capacity to learn more. In fact, the more art kids get, the smarter they become in subjects like math and science, and that's reason enough to make a parent say dough. For 10 simple ways to instill art in your kids' lives, visit americansforthearts.org. Throughout the text of the ad, parents are told both what to believe about arts education and how to act in response to the belief. There also might be a secondary audience for this ad, people who are not the main audience of the ad, but might also be able to respond to the exigence. For example, philanthropists who could raise money for arts education, or legislators who might pass laws for arts funding, or to require arts education in public schools could also be the intended audiences for this ad. Finally, you might want to think about the constraints or limitations on the ad. Sometimes these are harder to get at, but we can guess a few things. One constraint might be the cost of the ad. Different magazines charge differently for ad space as well as placement within the magazine, so the Ad Council could have been constrained by how much money they wanted to spend to circulate the ad. The ad is also only one page long, so there might have been limitations on the amount of space for the ad. Finally, the Ad Council's webpage. On the Ad Council's webpage, they list the requirements for organizations seeking the funding and support of the Ad Council. There are 12 criteria, but here are a few. The sponsor organization must be a private, nonprofit organization, private foundation, government agency, or coalition of such groups. The issue must address the Ad Council's focus on health and safety, education, or community. Applications which benefit children are viewed with favor as part of the Ad Council's commitment to children. And the issue must offer a solution through an individual action. The effort must be national in scope so that the message has relevance to media audiences and communities throughout the nation. Each of these criteria helps to understand the limitations on both who can participate as reader and what can be said. The exigent audience and constraints are only one way to understand the context of a piece of rhetoric, and of course, there are other ways to get at context. Some rhetoricians look at subject, purpose, audience, and occasion. Others might look at the rhetorical triangle of writer, reader, and purpose. An analysis using the rhetorical triangle would ask similar questions about audience as one using the rhetorical situation, but it would also ask questions about the writer and the purpose of the document. Asking questions about the writer helps the reader determine whether he or she is credible and knowledgeable. For example, the Ad Council has been creating public service announcements since 1942 and is a nonprofit agency. They also document their credibility by showing the impact of their campaign in several ways. Destruction of our forests by wildfires has been reduced from 22 million acres to less than 8.4 million acres per year since our forest fire prevention campaign began. And 6,000 children are paired with a mentor in just the first 18 months of our mentoring program. Based on this information, we can assume the Ad Council is a credible rhetor, and whether or not we agree with the rhetoric they present, we can probably assume it contains reliable information. Asking questions about the next part of the rhetorical triangle, the purpose of a piece of rhetoric, helps you understand what the rhetor is trying to achieve through the discourse. We can discern the purpose by asking questions like, what does the rhetor want me to believe after seeing this message? Or, what does the rhetor want me to do? In some ways, the purpose takes the exigence to the next step. If the exigence frames the problem, the purpose frames the response to that problem. The rhetorical situation and rhetorical triangles are two ways to begin to understand how the rhetoric functions within the context you find it. The key is to understand that no rhetorical performance takes place in a vacuum. One of the first steps to understanding a piece of rhetoric is to look at the context in which it takes place. Whatever terminology you or your instructor choose, it's a good idea to start by locating your analysis within a rhetorical situation. Okay, so we discussed the rhetorical situation, and now we're going to talk about the different types of rhetorical appeals. And you guys have studied these before, probably in English class. I don't know if you guys have had it speech or not, but more than likely probably in English class. So take a drink here, my coffee real quick. Sorry, allergies are murder right now. So, okay. The heart of the matter, the argument. The rhetorical situation is just the beginning of your analysis, though. What you really want is to understand the argument, what the rhetor wants you to believe or do, and how he or she goes about that persuasion. Effective argumentation has been talked about for centuries. In the 4th century BCE, Aristotle was teaching the men of Athens how to persuade different kinds of audiences in different kinds of rhetorical situations. Aristotle articulated 3 artistic appeals that a rhetor could draw on to make a case: logos, ethos, and pathos. So you might want to underline this part, highlight it, what have you. Logos is commonly defined as argument from reason, and it usually appeals to an audience's intellectual side. As audiences, we want to know the facts of the matter, and logos can help with these: statistics, data, and logical statements. For example, on our Homer ad for the arts, the text tells parents that the arts will build their capacity to learn more. In fact, the more art kids get, the smarter they become in subjects like math and science. You might notice that there aren't numbers or charts here, but giving this information appeals to the audience's intellectual side. That audience can see a continuation of the argument on the Ad Council's webpage. And again, much of the argument appeals to logos and draws on extensive research that shows that the arts do these things. They allow kids to express themselves creatively and bolster their self-confidence, teach kids to be more tolerant and open, improve kids' overall academic performance, and show that kids actively engaged in arts education are likely to have higher SAT scores than those with little to no arts involvement. Develop skills needed by the 21st century workforce: critical thinking, creative problem solving, effective communication, and teamwork, and more. And it keeps students engaged in school and less likely to drop out. Each bullet above is meant to intellectually persuade parents that they need to be more intentional in providing arts education for their children. Few of us are persuaded only with our mind, though, and even if we intellectually agree with something, it's difficult to get us to act unless we are persuaded in our heart. This kind of appeal to emotion is called pathos. Pathetic appeals, as rhetoric that draws on pathos is called, used alone without logos and ethos can come across as emotionally manipulative or overly sentimental, but are very powerful when used in conjunction with the other 2 appeals. It's kind of like, you guys seen those Sarah McLachlan videos for the ASPCA, where like she's singing Arms of the Angel and the dogs are crying and they're about to get euthanized and stuff. That is a pathetic appeal, and it is way too much pathos. Okay, so that is it makes you feel guilty, right? So, well, it does me anyway. Okay, emotional appeals can come in many forms: an anecdote or narrative, an image such as a photograph, or even humor. For example, on their web campaign, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals uses an image of this always makes me laugh, I'm sorry. Uses an image of a baby chick and of Ronald McDonald wielding a knife to draw attention to their Chicken McCruelty Happy Meal. So think about that when you go to lunch today. These images are meant to evoke an emotional response in the viewer and, along with a logos appeal about the statistics about how cruelly chickens are treated, persuade the viewer to boycott McDonald's. Pathos can also be a very difficult appeal if the rhetor has to persuade the audience in a short amount of time, which is why it's used heavily in print advertisements, billboards, or television commercials. An investment company will fill a 30-second commercial with images of families and couples enjoying each other, seeming happy, surrounded by wealth to persuade you to do business with them. The 30-second time spot doesn't allow them to give the 15-year projected growth of each of their funds, and pathetic appeals will often hold our interest much longer than intellectual appeals. The ad promoting the importance of art uses humor to appeal to the audience's emotional side. By comparing the epic poet Homer to Homer Simpson in his classic Doe, the ad uses humor to draw people to their argument about the arts. The humor continues as they ask parents if their kids know the difference between the Homers. The only Homer some kids know is the one who can't write his own last name. The ad also appeals to emotion through its language use, describing Homer as one very ancient dude and describing the Odyssey as the sequel to the Iliad. In this case, the humor of the ad, which occurs in the first few lines, is meant to draw the reader in and help them become interested in the argument before the ad gets to the logos, which is the last few lines of the ad. The humor also makes the organization seem real and approachable, contributing to the ethos. The humor might lead you to think that Americans for the Arts are not a stuffy bunch of suits, but an organization you can relate to, or one that has a realistic understanding of the world. Ethos, again, underline this, circle it, highlight it, whatever. Ethos refers to the credibility of the writer, which can be a person or organization. A writer can develop credibility in many ways. The tone of the writing, and whether that writing is appropriate for the context, helps build a writer's ethos, as does the accuracy of the information or the visual presentation of the rhetoric. In the Homer ad, the ethos is built in several ways. The simple, humorous, and engaging language, such as Greek gods, Achilles' heel, Trojan horse, all these icons are brought to us by very one ancient dude, Homer. In the Iliad and its sequel, the Odyssey, he presented Greek mythology in everyday language, draws the audience in, and helps the tone of the ad seem very approachable. Also, the knowledge of Greek mythology and the information about how the arts help children, which also contribute to the logos appeal, make the ad seem credible and authoritative. However, the fact that the ad does not use too many statistics or overly technical language also contributes to the ethos of the ad, because often sounding too intellectual can come across as pompous or stuffy. Aristotle's artistic appeals are not the only way to understand the argument of rhetoric. You might choose to look at the claim or the unstated assumptions of a piece. Someone else might consider the visual appeal of rhetoric, like the font, page layout, type of paper, or images. Another person might focus on the language use and the specific word choice and sentence structure of a piece. Logos, pathos, and ethos can provide a nice framework for analysis, but there are numerous ways to understand how a piece of rhetoric persuades. And the author of this chapter talks about like font and page layout and stuff. And I don't think, unless you've taken, journalism classes, or my background is in journalism and media, and maybe that's why I'm more sensitive to this. But when you're choosing a font, some of you take a very long time to choose the font that you want to tell what you want it to tell. Like if you were making an invitation for your little brother or your little cousin's cowboy birthday party, you're going to choose a font that's made out of ropes. If you are going to write your paper for me in this font made out of ropes, that's communicating a very different thing. So we communicate in all kinds of different ways, guys. And so I just want you to kind of be aware of that now that we've read this. Okay. So looking at the context and components of a piece of rhetoric often isn't enough, though, because it's important to draw conclusions about the rhetoric. Does it successfully respond to the exigence? Is it an ethical approach? Is it persuasive? These kinds of questions let you begin to create your own claims, your own rhetoric, as you take a stand on what other people say, do, or write. Beginning to analyze. Once you've established the context for the rhetoric, you're analyzing, and you can probably begin to think about how well it fits into the context. You've probably been in a situation where you arrived way underdressed for an occasion. You thought that the dinner was just a casual get-together with friends, and it turned out to be a far more formal affair, and you felt very out of place. There are also times when discourse fails to respond to the situation well. It doesn't fit. On the one hand, successful discourse often responds very well to the context. They address the problem, consider the audience's needs, provide accurate information, and have a compelling claim. One of the reasons you work to determine the rhetorical situation for a piece of discourse is to consider whether it works within the context. You can begin this process by asking questions like, and these are the questions we are absolutely going to ask whenever we're analyzing rhetoric. Does the rhetoric address the problem it claims to address? Is the rhetoric targeted at an audience who has the power to make change? Are the appeals appropriate to the audience? Does the rhetoric give enough information to make an informed decision? And does the rhetoric attempt to manipulate in any way by giving incomplete or inaccurate information or abusing the audience's emotions? What other subclaims do we have to accept to understand the writer's main claim? Like, for example, in order to accept the Ad Council's claim that the arts boost math and science scores, you have to first value boosting those scores. And what possible negative effects might come from this rhetoric? Rhetorical analysis asks how discourse functions in the setting in which it's found. In the same way that a commercial for denture cream seems very out of place when aired during a reality television show aimed at teenagers, rhetoric that does not respond well to its context often fails to persuade. In order to perform analysis, you must understand the context, and then you must carefully study the ways that the discourse does and does not respond appropriately to that context. The bottom line is that the same basic principles apply when you look at any piece of rhetoric, your instructor's clothing, an advertisement, or the president's speech. You need to consider the context and the arguments. As you begin to analyze rhetoric, there are lots of different types of rhetoric you may encounter in a college classroom, like a political cartoon, a Wikipedia entry, a scholarly article, a bar graph, an op-ed piece in a newspaper, a speech, a YouTube video, a book chapter, photograph, or a PowerPoint presentation. All the above types of discourse try to persuade you, and they may ask you to accept a certain kind of knowledge that's valid, and they may ask you to believe a certain way, or they may ask you to act. It's important to understand what a piece of rhetoric is asking of you, how it tries to persuade you, and whether that persuasion fits within the context you encounter it in. Rhetorical analysis helps you answer those questions. Implications of rhetorical analysis, or why do we do this stuff anyway? So you might be wondering, if you know how to do this analysis already, you can already tell what type of person someone is by their clothing or what a commercial wants you to buy without carefully listening to it, why do you need to know how to do more formal analysis? How does this matter outside a college classroom? Well, first of all, much of the reading and learning in college requires some level of rhetorical analysis. As you read a text chapter to prepare for a quiz, it's helpful to be able to distill the main points quickly. When you read a journal article for a research paper, it's necessary to understand the scholar's thesis. And when you watch a video in class, it's useful to be able to understand how the creator is trying to persuade you. But college isn't the only place where an understanding of how rhetoric works is important. You'll find yourself in many situations, from boardrooms to your children's classrooms or churches to city council meetings, where you need to understand the heart of the arguments being presented. One final example. In November 2000, Campbell's Soup Company launched a campaign to show that many of their soups were low in calories and showed prepubescent girls refusing to eat because they were watching their weight. A very small organization called Dads of Daughters, a group that fights advertising that targets girls with negative body images, contacted Campbell's explaining the problems they saw in an ad that encouraged young girls to be self-conscious about their weight and asked Campbell's to pull the ad. A few days later, Campbell's vice president of marketing and corporate communications called. One of the dads says, the vice president acknowledged he had received their letter, reviewed the ad again, saw their point, and was pulling the ad, responding to a couple of guys writing a letter. Individuals who understand rhetorical analysis and act to make change can have a tremendous influence on their world. So that's an introduction to rhetoric, and tomorrow we're going to talk about, or I don't know, maybe today if you guys are still watching, we're going to talk about different types of rhetorical devices that rhetorics use in order to get their point across. So, thanks a lot.